I first came across the name Gladys Ricart buried in a case file. A decade-old crime. A wedding turned into a crime scene. A man in a suit. A woman in a white dress. Blood on silk. But what kept me reading wasn't the violence, it was her. A face I couldn't look away from. A story that felt unfinished. Gladys was 39 when she died. A woman on the edge of a new life. What struck me wasn't just that she was murdered, it was the timing. The veil, the bouquet, the smile. She was steps away from the altar when her past caught up with her and pulled the trigger. To understand how that moment became possible, you have to understand her world, not just her last day, but the years that built up to it. Gladys Ricart came to the United States from the Dominican Republic in the 1980s, like thousands of others, chasing something better. She settled in Washington Heights, a neighborhood in Upper Manhattan often dubbed Little Doctor. Life there wasn't easy. Low wages, small apartments, big dreams, but it had a rhythm, and Gladys found her way into it. She was no victim in the passive sense. By the time she was in her 30s, Gladys had carved out a respectable life. She worked as a bookkeeper for a travel agency, took care of her family, helped send money home, and kept her circle tight. Friends described her as warm, sharp, a woman who could laugh easily and cook for 20 without blinking. But behind her generosity was a clear spine. She didn't suffer fools. She wasn't looking for a man to complete her, just one who could walk beside her. And for a while, she thought she found that in Agustin Garcia. Agustin was older, 47, when she died, a Dominican businessman with a reputation. He was educated, successful, polished. The kind of man who turned heads when he entered a room, especially in their community. He moved with confidence, dressed impeccably, spoke like someone who was used to being listened to. They dated for several years. On the surface, it seemed like a good match. Two professionals with shared roots, shared language, shared aspirations. They took trips. He spoiled her. Their relationship looked solid. But looked can be dangerous. Friends would later recall subtle changes. A possessiveness that crept into Agustin's behavior. Jealousy masked as concern. Comments that sounded sweet but carried barbs. At the time, no one had the words for it. Emotional abuse wasn't a term you heard much in Washington Heights in the 90s. Eventually, Gladys called it off. From what I found, it wasn't a loud breakup. No scenes. No police reports. Just a woman deciding she wanted something different. That should have been the end of it. But for Agustin, it wasn't. Gladys moved on. She met someone new, a man named James Preston, a kind, quiet soul. They weren't flashy, just steady, solid, real. Over time, they started building something, a future. When James proposed, she said yes without hesitation. And on September 26, 1999, her family and friends gathered to celebrate. The apartment on Wadsworth Avenue was buzzing with laughter, dresses, music, makeup artists, last-minute nerves. Gladys wore white. Not just any white, a full-length lace gown with a modest train. She looked radiant. Everyone says that. Not just beautiful, radiant. Like someone who'd worked hard to get to this day, who'd earned her joy. That morning, a wedding photographer started filming inside the apartment. The footage still exists. It shows Gladys handing out bouquets, hugging family, laughing with bridesmaids. She looked alive in every sense of the word. And in the background, invisible to everyone else, the past was walking toward her front door. On paper, Agustin Garcia looked like a success story. Born in the Dominican Republic, he immigrated to the U.S. and quickly found his way into the business world. By the 1990s, he was running a successful travel agency, well known in the Dominican-American community of New York and New Jersey. He had charm, polish, and connections. Politicians came to his events. He moved in social circles where status mattered. To many, he was a role model, proof that an immigrant could build something big. That's the man Gladys Ricart met. That's the version of him she dated. For a time, she genuinely believed he loved her. And maybe, in his own twisted way, he did. But love, real love, doesn't behave the way Agustin did once she tried to leave. From the outside, their relationship looked strong. They were seen at fundraisers together, at cultural events, dinner parties. He bought her gifts. He told her she was beautiful. But slowly, the compliments turned conditional. He didn't like her seeing certain friends. He questioned where she'd been if she came home late. He didn't want her wearing certain clothes. The red flags weren't shouted. They whispered. Controlling behavior, veiled as care. One friend told investigators that Agustin would show up uninvited to Gladys's workplace. Just to check in. He'd call repeatedly. Not always angry, just insistent. Demanding. like a man who didn't understand boundaries. Eventually, Gladys had enough. Sources close to her say she tried to end things respectfully. She wasn't afraid, not yet. Just tired, ready to move on. She had no idea that for Agustin, rejection would become a wound he couldn't tolerate. Because to a man like him, successful, admired, in control, being left wasn't just painful. It was insulting. When she started dating James Preston, it was a quiet shift. James wasn't flashy. He didn't wear power suits or host galas. He worked in telecommunications, stayed out of the spotlight, and most importantly, he made Gladys feel safe. That safety infuriated Agustin. He began appearing again, not as a threat, but as a man who wanted closure. He dropped by her office, uninvited. He left voicemails. Once, he even tried to give her a Bible, claiming he wanted to be a better man. But Gladys was firm. She told him it was over. She was moving on. And then came the invitations. When Gladys and James set the date for September 26, 1999, they sent formal wedding invitations. Agustin Garcia, of course, wasn't invited. It was meant to be a boundary. He took it as a trigger. I've seen the court transcripts. I've gone through the interviews. Agustin never threatened her openly. But something in him snapped when he realized she was serious. That she was going to marry someone else. That her life, her body, her future would belong to another man. He began watching. Waiting. Planning. On the surface, he acted calm. Told people he'd moved on. But beneath that calm, he was writing a different script, one in which he'd get the last word. He bought a .38 caliber revolver from a pawn shop in Florida, where he owned another home. He kept it quiet. He didn't tell anyone. But this was no moment of madness. No heat of the moment passion. This was premeditation. That gun would travel with him back to New York. It would sit, loaded, in his briefcase as he walked up the steps to Gladys Ricart's apartment on the morning of her wedding. And no one, not her family, not the bridesmaids, not even Gladys herself, could have imagined what would happen when she opened the door. There's something haunting about watching someone alive just minutes before they die. The home video from that morning shows Gladys Ricart in her element, directing, laughing, radiant in her wedding gown. She's giving her nephew instructions, fixing a boutonniere, cracking jokes in Spanish with her bridesmaids. The energy in the apartment is joyous, chaotic, alive. And then it isn't. It was Sunday, September 26, 1999. A warm day in Washington Heights. The kind of late September morning where the air still smells like summer. Gladys's apartment on Wadsworth Avenue was packed, family, friends, music, hairspray, last-minute questions. The photographer had already started rolling. Everyone was ready. Everyone except the man who rang the doorbell around 4 p.m. He wore a gray suit, carried a bouquet of red roses, and had a loaded revolver hidden inside a black briefcase. Agustin Garcia didn't knock like a madman. He didn't shout. He was calm. When the door opened, someone from inside the apartment recognized him. They didn't panic. Maybe they thought he was there to apologize, to wish her well, to make peace. What happened next took no more than 90 seconds. He walked into the living room, smiling. Gladys turned and saw him, standing there, flowers in hand, uninvited. Her expression shifted from confusion to shock. That's the moment caught on camera. Her eyes widen. Her smile fades. And then he opened the briefcase. One bridesmaid screamed. Another moved to intervene. But it was too late. Agustin pulled out the revolver and fired 3 times. The first shot hit Gladys in the chest. The second in her face. The third in her abdomen. She collapsed onto the floor in her wedding dress, white fabric blooming red. Panic erupted. Guests ran. Someone tackled Agustin to the ground. A cousin grabbed the gun. Children screamed. The camera, still recording, captured chaos, movement, shouting, the sound of someone sobbing in Spanish, La Mato, La Mato. He killed her. He killed her. The police arrived minutes later. Agustin didn't run. He didn't resist. Officers found him standing near the body, hands behind his back, as if waiting to be handcuffed. He didn't say a word. I visited that apartment. The Ricart family has since moved out, but the layout remains. Living room to the right. Small kitchen. A narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms. I stood where she stood, where he pulled the trigger, and the air still feels heavy. That moment, that act, wasn't impulsive. It was staged. Planned. He brought flowers to a wedding he wasn't invited to, wearing a suit, with a gun in a briefcase. That's not madness. That's control. And it left a mark not only on her family, but on an entire community. The funeral came days later. She was buried in her wedding dress. Hundreds attended. They didn't just mourn Gladys, they mourned the idea that a woman could build a life, walk away from a toxic relationship, find new love, and still not make it to the altar. In the Dominican-American community, the shock was visceral. This wasn't gang violence. It wasn't some late-night alley murder. This was a killing in broad daylight, in front of cameras, in a home, on a day meant for joy. It forced people to ask questions they hadn't asked before. About jealousy, about control, about what love becomes when one person can't handle not being the center of someone else's world. Agustin Garcia would later claim he blacked out, that he couldn't remember pulling the trigger. But there was no doubt he did. Too many saw it. Too many felt it. And the camera never stopped rolling. The footage of Gladys Ricart's murder was never made public. But the memory of it, the image of a bride gunned down on her wedding day, became a ghost in the neighborhood. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous man isn't a stranger in the dark. It's the one who used to say, "I love you." The trial of Agustin Garcia started nearly 2 years after he murdered Gladys Ricart. It took place in Bergen County, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River, but a world away from Washington Heights. The courthouse was quiet, almost sterile. But the case inside it pulsed with everything the crime had left behind: rage, grief, denial, and a quiet hunger for justice. Garcia didn't deny that he killed her. There were too many witnesses, too much evidence, and one too many seconds of video to claim otherwise. His defense had to pivot, not to what happened, but to why. They leaned into the old American standby: temporary insanity. The idea that a man, overwhelmed by heartbreak, can snap. That love, when betrayed, burns hot enough to destroy whatever stands in its way, even a woman in a white dress. His lawyers painted him as a man unraveling, a pillar of the Dominican-American community brought low by unbearable emotional pain. They described him as a devout Catholic, a successful businessman, a generous donor to local causes. But above all, a man whose heart had been broken beyond repair. That seeing Gladys moving on so completely, marrying someone else, turned him into someone he didn't recognize. They brought in psychologists who diagnosed him with brief reactive psychosis, a clinical term for an emotional collapse so severe it overrides all reason. They argued he wasn't in control, that he walked into that apartment with roses, not rage, that the gun was an afterthought, that he wasn't himself when he pulled the trigger. But the prosecution tore that version apart piece by piece. They didn't just argue, they dismantled. What they built was a story of deliberation, of planning, of control. They showed the receipt for the gun, purchased weeks in advance. They mapped out his travel records, how he flew from Florida back to New York, carrying the revolver in his luggage. They presented testimony from friends and coworkers who said Garcia seemed calm in the days leading up to the wedding. Focused, not manic, not confused, just quiet. He had called Gladys multiple times, stopped by her office uninvited, told her he wanted closure. But underneath the surface, he wasn't looking for peace. He was rehearsing a scene. He brought roses and a revolver. He wore a pressed gray suit. He knew exactly where to go and when. The moment he walked into that apartment, he didn't ask to talk. He didn't break down. He opened a briefcase and shot her 3 times. One of the prosecutors said it best: this wasn't a man who lost control. This was a man who couldn't stand losing it. The most powerful moment of the trial didn't come from the lawyers. It came from Gladys's younger brother, who took the stand with a photo of her in his hand, the one taken the morning she died. He told the jury how she had warned them that Agustin might try something, how she had gone silent on his calls, how she had tried to move on without dragging everyone else into her fear. She hadn't wanted to make a scene. She just wanted to get married. In the end, the jury didn't hesitate. They found Agustin Garcia guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence: life in prison, with a minimum of 30 years before he'd be eligible for parole. The courtroom was still. No cheers, no tears. Just the quiet closing of a chapter too heavy to celebrate. But Garcia didn't let it end there. From his cell in East Jersey State Prison, he began filing appeals, legal motions, technical claims, petitions for review. Each time, the same theme: that his mind had betrayed him, that he didn't deserve life for what he couldn't control. But the courts denied him, again and again, because the truth had already been decided, and no amount of paper could erase what was written in blood. By the time his final appeal was rejected, something had shifted. Outside those prison walls, Gladys Ricart's name had begun to mean something more than just a tragedy. It had become a symbol, a cause, And Agustin Garcia, the man who once demanded control over her life, was now powerless to stop what she had come to represent. By the time Agustin Garcia was locked away, most crime stories would have ended. The court had ruled. The killer was in prison. The news cycle had moved on. But for the people who loved Gladys Ricart, and for women who saw their own lives reflected in hers, the story was just beginning. It started small. A handful of women, mostly Dominican, mostly from New York, began gathering every year on the anniversary of her death. They wore white. Not just because it was the color Gladys wore that day, but because it was the color she never got to wear down the aisle. They called it the Marcha de las Novias, the Bride's March. The first one took place in 2001, while Garcia was still awaiting trial. A few dozen women walked from Washington Heights through Upper Manhattan, holding framed photos of Gladys. Some carried signs with her name. Others wore veils. It was quiet, dignified, angry, and it grew. Every September since, the march has returned. Bigger, louder, broader. Women from across Latin America have joined, some survivors of domestic violence, others marching for sisters, daughters, mothers who never made it out. Some wear wedding dresses. Others just wear white. But the message is the same. This doesn't end with Gladys. What happened to her wasn't a fluke. It wasn't an act of passion. It was part of a pattern, one where women who dared to leave are punished for choosing themselves. I walked with them in 2019, 20 years after her murder. It was humid that day, and the streets were loud, but the silence of the marchers cut through everything. They didn't chant. They didn't carry megaphones. They just walked, block after block. A line of women in white, moving forward. At one point, they passed the building where Gladys used to live. Some paused. A few crossed themselves. Others just stared up at the windows. One woman next to me whispered in Spanish, "She's still here." What struck me wasn't just the grief, it was the sense of purpose. This wasn't about mourning anymore. It was about warning. About saying to the next Gladys, you don't have to wait until it's too late. Advocacy groups took notice. So did city officials. In the years since, the Bride's March has become a focal point for awareness about intimate partner violence, particularly in immigrant communities, where cultural stigma and fear of deportation often keep women silent. Gladys's name appears in policy reports. Her story is used in training programs for counselors, teachers, even police. And it hasn't just stayed in New York. Marches have sprung up in other cities: Miami, Chicago, Providence. The movement carries her photo like a banner. The image of a woman who should have gotten married that day, but didn't. There's something deeply powerful about turning a moment of horror into a ritual of resistance. About refusing to let a murder be just a statistic. Gladys Ricart's killer took her life. But he couldn't take the story. That now belongs to the women who walk in white, year after year, mile after mile. And while Garcia files appeals from prison, claiming he's been wronged, the world outside keeps marching. Without him. Over him. Because the most important chapter of this story didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the streets, when women decided that a white dress shouldn't end in blood. It should end in freedom. I stood in front of the building on Wadsworth Avenue where Gladys Ricart was killed. It's still there. The same red brick. The same black gate. Nothing about it says that a woman died here in her wedding dress. People walk by, lost in their own days. Cabs honk. Children chase each other across the sidewalk. The city has moved on as cities do. But I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't there in 1999. I didn't know Gladys. I never heard her laugh, or watched her dance, or saw her look in the mirror and fix her hair the way her friends said she always did. But over these past months, she's been in every room I entered. Every interview. Every police report. Every photo I examined, trying to catch a glimpse of who she was before that final frame. So I reached out to her brother, Jose. He didn't agree to a formal interview. Said he was tired of talking. I understood. But he did meet me, just once, in a small park a few blocks away. We didn't speak for long. We didn't need to. I asked him what he remembered most about her. He said, she made you feel like your life could start over. Not because she fixed anything for you, but because she reminded you that joy didn't have to be loud, or perfect, or even permanent. Just honest. That hit me harder than anything in the court files. Gladys wasn't trying to change the world. She was trying to build a life. A modest, stable, beautiful life. One with love in it. One where she got to choose who stood beside her. And for that, she was killed. Not because she was reckless. Not because she didn't see it coming. But because she dared to leave a man who believed her body, her time, her future, still belonged to him. Agustin Garcia sits in a prison cell in Woodbridge, New Jersey. He'll be eligible for parole in 2032, though there's no indication yet of whether the board will grant it. He still files appeals, still insists the system misunderstood him. But the world has moved past his excuses. Gladys's family, they moved too. Not away, but forward. Her nieces grew up. One became a teacher. Another works in immigration law. Every year, they still join the bride's march, walking beside strangers who now carry her name. There's no gravesite big enough to hold the kind of legacy Gladys left behind. It's not in stone. It's in the conversations her death started. The shelters named after her. The teenage girls who hear her story and recognize something they weren't sure they could name. And it's in the white dresses. Every year, still moving down city streets. Silent. Steady. Refusing to disappear. Gladys Ricart didn't make it to her wedding. But she became something else. A warning. A symbol. A presence. A voice still echoing in places where women are told to be quiet, to forgive, to stay. We failed her in life. The least we can do is carry her name forward in truth. I'm Alex Carter. And this is the story of the bride who never made it to the altar, but who walked on anyway.